Shereen Bhan. We're coming to you live from Washington, D.C. as we wait for the meeting between Prime Minister Modi and President Donald Trump. Joining me is a very special guest, a familiar face on CNBC TV 18,
Yes.
and today the chairman of the US IBC as well as the executive chairman of Cisco and an all-time India bull, John Chambers. It's so good to have you back on CNBC TV 18.
It's a pleasure to be here again, and not only am I an old bull in terms of India's future, I actually think what you're seeing isn't a new peak. I think it's India that you're just going to be surprised. It's just the beginning. So I'm more optimistic about India now than ever, and the importance of the relationships between the Indian business and the U.S. business and between our countries.
So let me talk to you about specifics, John. And as I pointed out, you've been a long-term India investor. Cisco's been committed to India. In fact, you set up your first global center outside of the US in India, in Bangalore, and that was really the start of the way that the world looked at India. But in terms of forward convergence and forward momentum, in light of the conversations that you had with the Prime Minister yesterday, where do you see this headed?
So in the sequence you raised, first, it wasn't just a global center, the first one. It was our second world headquarters in India. That's how much I believed in your country. In the last 3 years, you've seen more movement out of India than almost any other country in the world. And while all of us wanted to move faster, it's amazing how far this Prime Minister has brought the country with 1.3 billion people. If you watch his pace of reforms at Digital India, the goods and services tax, which will be a game changer for the economy, the courage to make demonetization and to digitize the average person's life in India, and to outline how you do this on an exclusive basis has been amazing. And while we always want to move faster, I've been amazed at how much improvement he's made on ease of doing business and creating the right environment for it. In terms of your question, in terms of yesterday, each time I'm with this Prime Minister, and I've had the honor to do it many times, he is an amazing man. He is unusual that he's able to see a vision of what he wants to accomplish, break it down to strategy, and then to push himself and his whole team to say, how do we accomplish it? And while we obviously cannot go into specifics of individual conversations from yesterday, for over an hour and a half, he listened to everyone in the room, and then he responded to every single person with his thoughts and comments. There are very few people in the world that could do that effectively. And so he outlined a vision for India and a partnership between India and the U.S., which is a partnership of both economic and innovation. I personally believe it's the most strategic partnership the U.S. and U.S. business should have in the world. That's why I volunteered to be the chairman of the U.S. India Business Council, so I'm extremely biased, but for a good reason. You're talking about the two largest democracies in the world. You're talking about the ability through digitization, whether it's in this country or in India, to change the lives of every citizen. You're talking about a vision of how government moves with a speed that they've not seen before and is willing to take good business and economic risk with a vision of what the power of the two countries could be together. Job creation, innovation, economic growth. 115 billion in trade currently between our countries. Everybody gets excited about who has a little bit more or less. That's not the real issue. The real issue is, can we take this to 500 billion? Can we generate a huge number of jobs in the U.S. and India because of this relationship? And I'm delighted that our two presidents, they've talked on the phone, they've both tweeted on topics, etc. Delighted that they're having the face-to-face meeting today. I'm optimistic about the outcome.
You know, you spoke about that $500 billion target, and Prime Minister Modi today in his op-ed has spoken about that. You're absolutely right. We're now at 115 billion, up from about 45 odd billion a decade
you know your
ago.
Numbers well.
A decade ago.
Let me look at those notes. Let me see what I can say. Okay.
Okay. So he hasn't set a timeline to. He just says that we hope that trade will increase manifold, but there is no timeline to the $500 billion target. By when do you expect that to be a reality?
Well, Shereen, what you're asking is the most important point that you make in digitization. What you have to do is build a foundation. You have to set ambitious goals. The days of looking how do you improve or grow our economy about 2 or 3% are gone. You have to set a goal that really stretches everyone and say, how do we move to these goals? The excitement of what I've seen across India is the Prime Minister has these goals for the nation. We have goals at US IBC for the joint trade. We set ambitious goals, which we agree with, the 500 billion. And then you say, how do you have to move to get there? What I'm seeing, and the example was 20 CEOs yesterday, that was a dramatically different meeting that would have occurred 3 years ago. All very, very positive. And a true exchange of ideas of listening. The improvement on ease of doing business has been dramatic. The improvement on the reforms has been dramatic. All of us want to go faster, but India is moving faster than most any other country in the world. And so if you watch what this really means in terms of trades and jobs, I would argue it would be sooner rather than later. We are at an inflection point between not the relationships between our countries. Our countries will get along great. India and the U.S. will be among the top 3 economies in the world in 2050. And so the ability to really do ecosystems and partners, the Prime Minister outlined a win-win relationship, and that's also what's impressed me since the first time I've met him. He often looks at the business person opposite the table or the country opposite the table or the citizens and say, how do we win together? How do we, using the example of Make in India show in terms of Mumbai a year and a half ago, the comment that he made that stuck with me to this day is, you take 1 step with India, we'll take 2 steps for you. And it is that willingness to create a win-win that is so key. So to get to the 500 billion sooner rather than later, I watch the progress each year. If yesterday was an indication, I think it was. Both sides can win. And the key is, how do we get several hundred billion each in this process, not who has a little bit more or less than the other.
You're right about that. You know, President Trump has made it clear that he believes in bilateral engagement, he believes in bilateral deals, not so much in the multilateral system. And what we've seen happen between India and the US is investment has really been driven by private sector collaboration. If I were to again look at the numbers, Indian companies have invested worth about $15 billion in the US companies have invested about $20 billion. Do you see this private sector engagement outside of the traditional areas of IT, manufacturing, etc.? Do you see this now moving on to newer sunrise sectors? Renewable energy is being talked about as one big focus area. Defense, of course, is the other. Aviation. Where do you see the next legs of opportunity?
Well, you know, it's a little bit like digitization. People often ask which areas will be most affected most. Digitization in India or in the U.S. will go across every vertical. And so when I look at the bilateral cooperation, it will also go across every vertical, from retail to defense to the key growth segments. If you watch, and this is the fun thing about watching your country and loving it so much, it doesn't matter if you're in Rajasthan or Andhra Pradesh or Gujarat, each of them have their matrix for how do they achieve digitization in their state. And you're talking 30 to 70 million people in the states, and they look about how they grow their economy, not at 7%, but perhaps in double digits. And India will be the fastest growing economic engine in the world, and I said that 3 years ago. I used to describe India as having the chance to move from a slow follower to a very rapid innovator. I think that transition has occurred. And the inflection point that now exists between our countries to really say, how do each of us win on this, is what's got me so excited on it. So it'll be every industry, but it'll be every state. And the exciting thing about what digitization can do, it doesn't matter if you're in the US or India or France, which is another country that's moving very rapidly on it. You can do this inclusive of all the citizens. And it's one of the things that Cisco does so well, is we say, how do we win together on GDP growth? How do we win together on education with network academies and new global problem solver capabilities, targeting the young people in India, 10 to 14 years of age, regardless of gender and location, about how you take action figures and animation and get people excited when we often lose them about talking about solving global problems, looking at entrepreneurship, teamwork, and suddenly young men and women who didn't think their ideas were good learn how to operate in this, and they get excited about what you talk about all the time, startups, about being part of the process, and they see themselves as inclusive in the future. True in the US, true in Europe, true in India.
You know, you talked about startups, and yes, I'm passionate about startups. I know you are
and
too.
I'm committing to you. I will be on your show with you to do that. I coach probably 30 CEOs of startups every month. I meet with probably, if you add up the big groups and little groups, several thousand startups a month, and probably 10 or 15 individual ones. Startups will be where almost all job creation occurs, either small business getting bigger or startups. While big companies may or may not add headcount over the next decade, and government may or may not, the engine of economic growth, whether it's 101.2 million people a month in India, or in the US 200 to 250,000, it will be largely startup driven.
So since you're focusing so much on startups through the USIBC
Yeah.
or through Cisco, what can we expect in terms of nurturing the startup ecosystem in India?
Well, the exciting part is, as you know, I'm a bull on this as well. For both, it's the right thing to do in terms of partnership, but it's also a good decision for Cisco. We've committed over $70 million to the startup engine in India. I meet with the startups in India all the time. Every visit I'm there, I meet with a set of startups. I will probably even someday personally invest in several of them. But more importantly, what you'll see from Cisco is a partnership on how do we create this environment. Startups need four things. They need access to capital. We can help in that, and we bring venture capital investors along with us, just like we have in other countries like France and Europe, as an example. They need talent. So we will focus on how do you do network academy training and how do you change the education system to generate the jobs of the future. They need access to market. And so whether it's with the CIOs of our federal government that I met with this morning, or the business leaders or government leaders in India, reminding them that it's important to also give startups an opportunity in terms of how do you move forward. And then they need literally coaching on how they scale and how they think about markets differently. It'll be fun to discuss when I'm on your show.
Well, we would love to have you on the show, John, but let me ask you about some of the concerns that U.S. lawmakers have raised. And these are sort of perpetual concerns when they talk about India, and perhaps there isn't enough appreciation of the ground that India has covered on issues like IPR, for instance, or even FDI, and we've seen a significant degree of liberalization. Do you think there is a lack of appreciation, at least within some quarters, within the U.S. lawmaking community, on the ground that India has covered?
Well, I think several things. First is lots of times when you look at it, doesn't matter if it's lawmakers in India or the U.S., they have to cover so many different topics. One of the things we're very proud of at USIBC, U.S. India Business Council, and Mukesh Aghi and Gaurav are amazing there, and the jobs that they do is we've hosted over 27 delegations on this. We've had a number of joint website interactivities in terms of what can be done. So we found that on both sides, the more each lawmakers in India gets educated about the U.S. and the U.S. get educated about India, the more we'll see our goals are so similar. In our values in terms of what's important to us, the largest democracies, our values about inclusive economic growth, our values about innovation. So I found that the more the lawmakers spend time together, and U.S. India Business Council has played a key role both ways on making that happen, the more they understand the changes. So I think it's one of education for all of us, and it's one of the reasons I'm so proud to be perhaps one of the strongest bulls on India, maybe one of the strongest ambassadors, is I believe in your country and I believe in the win-win partnership that is always conveyed with all the groups in terms of our country.
Given the fact that you're continuing to be very, very confident about the India story, the growth that India offers, I know that USIBC does these dipstick surveys, and I think the last one you spoke about a number between 45 and 48 billion dollars of the kind of commitments that US companies could make to India.
Yes.
As you sort of sat there with the top 20 CEOs of America, listening to what the Prime Minister had to say, do you feel that perhaps we could do better than that number?
Well, I think having watched yesterday and the optimism of the CEOs and the effectiveness of the Prime Minister in communicating, not just communications, it wasn't an event, it was an expansion of a partnership. And where 3 to 4 years ago, many companies were hesitant about investing in India and making a partnership and it being a two-way approach, today you don't see that at all. So there were probably 20 bulls in that meeting yesterday, and your Prime Minister did an amazing job of bringing them with him.
Do you see pension funds, for instance, investing in India? Do you finally see the insurance sector attracting investment from the US? Because these have been areas where we have opened up, but the concerns continue, for instance, on control norms and so on and so forth. But do you believe that now we're going to start to see money coming into some of these sectors as well?
Well, I think per your earlier question, we're going to see opportunities across all industry verticals for effects of our economic and innovation and partnerships between our countries. I think a large part of it has to do with continued focus on regulation and removing hurdles on both sides in terms of how we work together on common goals. And if you really look, the 7,000 regulation changes, 7,000 was amazing in terms of the approach. And if you watch the improvement on ease of doing business, I wish you could turn an aircraft carrier on a dime like a small race boat. It takes time. And so I admire the Prime Minister's vision and his realistic step-by-step approach, but also he doesn't mind jumping in on individual situations, which is really unusual for a leader and very, very positive.
The Prime Minister said that we've overcome the hesitations of the past and we're now moving towards greater convergence. As Prime Minister Modi gets ready to meet with President Trump, what is your expectation realistically? This is their first meeting, so largely meet and greet, I would imagine, exploratory, but what would your key expectation be?
Well, I think it's very important that two great leaders really get to know each other. I'm delighted they're meeting face to face, and I think that is a very, very good second step. They've obviously had good phone exchanges. I think the ability to look at where the inflection point is between our countries, and it's a positive win-win inflection point, and the ability to understand the priorities of each and build that trust up between the organizations. It's much like the U.S.-India Business Council. The way we operated 10 years ago and 20 and 30 years ago, the reason I got so excited when I had a chance to be the chairman is I realized we could perhaps do more in the next 5 years than we did in the 35 before that. And the foundation's been laid in terms of the opportunities. But when you get an inflection point between countries, between businesses, and a true ecosystem type of approach, you can do things you haven't done before. That requires the U.S.-India Business Council to evolve. It requires both of our governments' working relationship to evolve. So I think this, and I'm very optimistic about the outcomes, but you said it right, it's the first of a series of steps.
Do you think a U.S.-India free trade agreement could be something that will now seriously be taken forward?
I think they're going to look at how they work together, and this is where I think it's so important that we in the business community don't speculate, or the media. Let's let our leaders really figure out how to do this in a true win-win fashion.
Okay, let me end then, John, by asking you, for 2017, what would qualify as being a measure of success of our relationship with the U.S.? Do you expect a large degree of continuity? And there's no reason to sense any kind of departure from what the previous administration had done with India, which was to really build on significant momentum and cover a lot of ground over the last 3 years.
Well, I think that you set the goal too low. I actually think if you look, and remember again, if you measure progress in a quarter or a year, that's the wrong way to think about things. When you make fundamental change, whether it's demonetization, you make fundamental change on regulatory changes, you make fundamental changes on the good and services tax, which I do think is a game changer for India, you have to have the patience of how this occurs. So at the same time, you want to set audacious goals. So I think 500 billion is a doable number in joint trade. I think the ability for our countries and our companies to work together in ways they've never done before is very much within our sights. I do think we're at an inflection point. It requires the courage to change. I believe in our government leaders finding a way to do that. I believe in our business leaders finding a way to do that. I believe in our citizens finding a way to do that. And not only do I think India am I the bull on India, I think you haven't seen anything yet in terms of what India and the U.S. can do together.
We haven't seen anything yet. That's the word coming in here from John Chambers, the India bull, perhaps one of the biggest India bulls that we've seen over the last few years. John, it's always a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you very much for your time. And we hope to see you on our show on startups as we turn 16.
I'm committing to do that. So you've got the ball, because I love to talk about startups, and it is so fun because you get to spend time with these CEOs and be excited about challenging them, and then you also get to give them back the problems, much like you do grandkids at the end of the session. So I look forward to it.
Well, many thanks. With that, it is time for us to take a quick break, but remember, we continue our coverage here live from Washington, D.C. ahead of Prime Minister Modi's meeting with President Trump. We're back in a minute.